Hi, my name is John Shannon. I was the Shuttle Program Manager at Johnson Space Center from about February 2008 to the end of the program in August 2011, and that encompassed the last 14 flights of the Shuttle program.
Hello, my name is Sue Leibert, and I was the Space Shuttle Human Capital Transition Manager since 2005 until the end of the Space Shuttle program. In January of 2005, the year after the Columbia accident, the President announced a new vision for space exploration. As a piece of that vision, they decided to shut down the Space Shuttle program in 2010. Obviously, that has a huge impact on the workforce, and so one of the big concerns right from the beginning was what would this do to the workforce, and would that workforce stay till the end of the Space Shuttle program?
So when I came into the program, we had already gotten direction from the President and the administration that we were going to end the Shuttle program. And that caused a lot of consternation about how do you keep the team around? How do you make sure that you have the right critical skills mix to fly out safely and successfully? And of course, being the program manager, you have to balance a lot of different risks. And one of the risks is the human capital piece, but you can't just go off and say, well, I'm going to retain all 15,000 contractors and 3,000 civil servants and pay them $1 million at the end of the program, right? That would solve your human capital problem, but it would cause obviously some other problems. Some of the issues we faced towards the end of the program, not only did we have the drawdown of the contractor ranks, but we had a strong directive from the International Space Station program to make sure that we left them in absolutely the best condition we possibly could. And that was because of concerns over the commercial efforts that were going on to take cargo and crew up and basically replace the shuttle. So we wanted to leave the station in a really good configuration. And what that meant to the shuttle program was we had a certain number of missions. We were actually going to only fly about 18 missions after Columbia. But we had 2 additional missions we could fly if we stayed within our budget and if we were doing okay on schedule. Additionally, Congress wanted us to fly an additional payload called the alpha magnetic spectrometer. And we really had a strong desire from the science community to go fly that. So there was strong budgetary pressures to stay within a very tight budget constraints. There were also strong pressures to stay basically on schedule. And we knew if we did those 2 things, then we would be rewarded by being able to fly up to 4 additional flights at the end of the program. And again, that was very important for the ISS guys. So that balanced against what you could do to retain your people and what you could do, how much money you could go spend in retention and things like that. It was also not a time that was free of technical issues. We had some of our most difficult technical issues in the last 2 years of the program. We had one issue with a valve that came apart and could have caused catastrophic damage in a propulsion system. And 3 flights from the end, we had a structural failure of our large external tank. Those were very, very detailed technical and engineering problems that we had to get through. So the overall matrix of what we were dealing with as a program was significant schedule pressure, significant budget pressure, significant technical issues that required a lot of work to overcome. And laid up against that was the fact that for the contractor side, all of these people knew that they were going to lose their jobs in the run-up to the end of the program or at the end of the program. For civil servants, the risk was not losing their jobs, but they were going to change jobs. They were going to go to a new career, something new that they were doing. And as you know, it's kind of the first people out get the best choice of jobs, right? You don't want to be the last guy holding the stick well, the only job we have for you is something that they're not interested in. So that was a concern on the civil servant side. And it was extremely difficult. We put a huge premium with the contractor workforce and on the civil servant side with being extremely honest about what we were doing and why, and making sure that the people knew that even though we had budget problems and schedule problems and technical issues, that they came first, and that we were, as best we could within the constraints we had, both legally and just from a budget standpoint, that we were going to take care of them. And that care was not just monetarily, it was communication. Let them be able to have the opportunity to plan their life. So it was a very challenging time for us.
So obviously with that impact to the workforce, one of the big things was retention of critical skills. And so that became a top program risk probably in about 2005 or so. And during that period of time, the community did a fair amount of benchmarking. We talked to the Titan program, Lockheed Martin, and the Air Force. We talked to a variety of other organizations, NAVAIR, NAVC. We talked to the Department of Defense about some BRAC activity they had. We talked to some major contractors about some other things that they did, and tried to gather a series of lessons learned. And those benchmarking reports are available for folks to take a look at. Benchmarking was very useful to us in a variety of forums. We learned an awful lot from the benchmarking. In particular, Titan was the closest to us. It's a major program, long-term program, a lot of history in that program. So we learned some things. One is the value of communication, which we knew anyway, but how important that was. How much the employees were devoted to the Titan program is very similar to how much the employees were devoted to the Shuttle program. That there's a sense of loss at the end of the program, and so that we can't underestimate what that will do, and that there's a sense of distraction, and that things like monetary and support services are important to helping the workforce not feel so distracted. So those are some lessons that we took away from that. In addition, I think just the fact that we did benchmarking helped us an awful lot with our internal customers and our external customers. It gave us a lot more credibility with people to be able to say, these are some things that Titan did that helped make them successful, or NAVAIR or NAVC, and this is why we want to do those same things. At that time, the Space Shuttle program was about would have been 15,000-ish contractors, and would have been a couple of 3,000 civil servants. The program was, on the civil servant side, primarily Kennedy Space Center, Marshall Space Flight Center, Johnson Space Center, and Stennis. A little bit also at Dryden at White Sands Test Facility. Contractors, the major contractor locations would be in Florida for ground operations, would be out at Lockheed Martin for Michoud for the external tank, California for the main engine, out in Utah for the boosters, and then also in Houston for space for operations. So you had workforce from coast to coast on both the civil servant and the contractor side, and then you had two groups of contractors. You had those building hardware, and that hardware would end before the program ended, and then you had another group that needed to stay to the end of the program because they were doing either operations or they were doing ground processing or post-mission processing. So you had two different kinds of groups that you needed to support. So it comes down to what was the risk. The risk was that given that the end of the program's going to end, that you have the possibility that you won't be able to retain critical skills. And you have to remember this was all going on in 2005. The program at that point was looking to end in 2010. So you have people that now are looking 5 years out, and do they want to stay to the end of a program that they know is going to go away? And so that became the top risk, is those critical skills, keeping them to the end of the program.
Now let's talk a little bit about the way I did it as a program manager. Is there were really three distinct groups of employees. We had the 15,000 contractors, and I divided the contractors up really into two groups. There were those that were manufacturing, and for manufacturing jobs, once they produced the last whatever it was that they were producing, then their job would go away. And there was not a lot of retention concern there. It was just as you hit the end of whatever they were doing, then that job would disappear. And that was a very slow ramp down. As you built the last solid rocket booster or external tank or processed the last engine, then each of those workstations, as you went through them, you knew those people would be laid off. And most of those contracts were managed out of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. And that was the death by 1,000 cuts. It was emotionally extremely difficult because, every day, every week, you're laying some people off. The second group of contractors were those that were either sustaining engineering for those manufacturing or integration operations, or the operations people that actually put together the vehicle, launch the vehicle, operate it on orbit, and land it safely. Now, those folks were different because they were in it to the end. They were going to be with the program until the last wheel stop and the vehicle had been safed and the crew was out. And so that was this group of about 6,000 to 7,000 contractors that it was kind of this impending storm, this impending doom, right, that's going to come up. They're doing their job. It's just like any other day over the last 20 years, working through everything. But they knew at the end of the day on STS 133 for Discovery, 134 for Endeavour, 135 for Atlantis, that was it. And they would end up losing that job. And that was really the group that you targeted for things like retention incentives, for making sure that monetarily they would be rewarded if they hit the milestones to stay till that end time. Retention incentives for the manufacturing team was not quite as important, but for the ops and sustaining engineering team, it was absolutely critical. The third group was the civil servants. And while they did not have a monetary retention incentive, it was all about the next job. They had job security, but it was going to be a new and different job. And the way we approach that is a lot of communication, a lot of working with the individual person to understand what they would like to do next. And then instead of having them leave and go do that job, we job shared. And we took the civil servants and we basically forced them to go find another job that they could do part-time while they were doing shuttle activities to integrate themselves in a new work environment, maybe doing Constellation or Space and Life Sciences or training or wherever. And they would spend time. And that was a benefit because it helped those other organizations because they got new manpower to do things, but it also helped the shuttle team because it lowered the angst level tremendously. People knew they had a home. And I required each of my senior leadership team members to basically go person by person and give me the list on the civil servant side of who was going where and what they were going to do. Make sure that you had everybody taken care of. And we didn't have everybody taken care of. Some people really resisted doing it. But for the most part, I'd say 75, 80% of the people embraced that idea and really went off and found other jobs they could do while they were doing shuttle activities. It was a win-win for both organizations. We retained our people. The other organizations got additional free help of very high-quality employees that could really help them out. So you had the manufacturing contractors. Basically, they're going to be let go. The contractor leadership handled that, and that was not as big of an impact. But honestly, for me, it was more tracking the numbers to make sure that we were letting the team members go on the schedule we had planned. Because remember, I'm on tight budget constraints here. I really want to fly these last 4 flights. So when and it happened a couple times, when a contractor got off their schedule and we expected to see a dip in the number of employees and they would stay up high, we questioned the contractor leadership very closely about why we needed to retain those people and what was the issue with getting them off the shuttle rolls. For the sustained engineering and operations contractors, that was more making sure that we had the correct retention incentives in their agreements, that they would want to stay from a monetary standpoint, and that we tracked very closely with these red, green, yellow charts all the critical skills, make sure that those folks were sticking around. Because honestly, some people, even though they'll have a big incentive, money incentive at the end of a program, they may decide, you know, I have to get on with my life. I have to make sure that my family is secure. And if a job opportunity came up, they might take it. So you still have to very closely track that. And then with the civil servants, it was all communications and detail work to make sure that they were job sharing. It was a very different approach for each of those three different groups that we ended up taking. And ultimately, it was very successful. Now, the one thing I didn't, actually two things that I didn't talk about that were really key that I really had no control over. We were just beneficiaries of a very poor economy. In other words, there were not tremendous opportunities out in the workplace where they could go, like to petrochem or other places. Some left to other industries, but the economic situation was fairly poor, especially in Florida, somewhat in Alabama, not as much here at Johnson Space Center. But in Florida, it would, you know, the shuttle job was a job that you had, and you would take it for all it was worth because there weren't a lot of other things out there. That benefited us, and I had no control over that at all. The other one that I think was significant was loyalty to the program. And this would just break your heart because people felt so strongly that they had been with this program for so many years and had put so much of themselves into the program, they couldn't imagine not seeing it through to successful end. They felt that visceral need to make sure that their program ended well. And they were not going to leave no matter what. And you can't predict that. And I don't think, that's one reason I think that benchmarking the shuttle program retirement may lead you to some false conclusions, because I don't think every other program or project out there has that same level of loyalty that the shuttle program did. Matter of fact, there were several instances where I thought on civil servants I was doing them a favor, right, where I would take an institutional job and say, look, you know, we're not going to wait to the end of the program when everyone is scrambling around looking for their new job. I'm going to move you to this new organization now, and we'll just put you in there, and then we'll borrow you back if we need you. And that met with some very irritated people, that here I was taking them off of their program before the end and forcing them to go to this other job. And I thought it was in their best interest, but turned out that loyalty was such a huge factor. And that was not one or two people. That was a lot of people. And that I learned my lesson, and I stopped trying to move people early before the end of the program, or we would communicate and make sure that we understood their desires and needs before we would take that kind of action. But the bad economy and the fierce loyalty to the program, I think, really benefited our efforts to retain people. Now, we could have really screwed it up, you know, by poor communication or not having the right retention or whatever else. But I think those two things really helped us out. And those are very unpredictable things in any other program. You know, when you think about the different kinds of distractions that you might have, those budgetary issues and technical issues, that's a kind of a double-edged sword, because it's very nice that you've got people occupied and working, and as they're working through technical problems, well, it's a very familiar territory to them, and it helps them to stay at their job and be very engaged in it. And they don't have a lot of time to think about what's going to happen to me in 4 years, you know, when I lose this job. But on the flip side, you know, there's that constant worry, and the shuttle team was pretty amazing because they were able to compartmentalize, I think, their concerns about future work from the work they were doing to make sure that the program was safe and successful. And if they weren't able to do that, that would have been very difficult. Some of the tools that we used to make sure that we were on the right track that were really important to us. So one was we did surveys, which we got very good response back, and it helped. I think the thing the surveys helped the most was to point us to areas of communications that we needed to focus on and make sure that the managers were talking to the team. You have to realize this was grief. This was a grieving process. People knew that something they loved was going to end, and communication cannot be overstated, the importance of it, and how you have to do that in many different ways. You can't just talk to people in the staff meeting. You also have to do emails, you have to do websites, you have to make sure that they have the ability to respond to surveys, that you're available for brown bags and questions and answers. Because not one thing will catch everybody, but if you do many different communications efforts, you're going to get most of the people. And that was very important. We were very rigorous also in our assessment of the risk. We would have top risk reviews. The civil service and contractor workforce status was reviewed at every single one of those in great detail. We would do budget reviews where we would look at workforce, and we would add back workforce if we needed to in some areas where maybe we had overshot. We did that in the external tank program. I had many, probably weekly, conferences with the contractor leadership to make sure that I understood where they were and what activities they were taking. And I should, as an aside, I have to say that the contractor leadership really stepped up. There wasn't a single contractor senior personnel issue out there. Every single one of them were dedicated to seeing the program end successfully and taking care of their people. And they had the hardest job because their people were going away. Their job and their company, in some instances, was going away. And they were really dedicated. But part of that dedication was that they needed assurance from me that we were on a plan. We were going to execute that plan. We all understood it. We understood when people would be let go, what the retention incentives were going to be. There was an issue with the pension fund. We made commitments that we would make sure that we did everything in our power to make sure the pension fund was funded. And it was just a lot of discussion, and we built a lot of trust between the civil service and the contractor leadership to make sure that we had discussed that, the importance, and that they were really committed. And they really did an amazing job. And I think the right focus was that, hey, we didn't want this to happen. We didn't want the program to end. We thought it was premature. We did not think from a national perspective that this was the right answer. But this was the decision that was made. Given that was the decision, we were going to make sure that the program ended on the right note, that we ended strong. And the contractor personnel and the leadership really took a strong role in making sure that happened. And I can't say enough about how well they did. So the focus I would put on it is that you have to be honest. You can't hide anything. It's not good news, but you have a plan early on. You say, here's when we're going to let people go. Here's why. Here are the constraints we have for different retention incentives or completion bonuses or award fees or any of the monetary stuff. And you allow people to make decisions and plan their lives. And that communication was, I thought, throughout the last year or so of the program, worked really well both ways. We were very honest in what we could do, what our expectations were. They were very honest in letting us know if they had any issues or any plans had changed. And I'm extremely proud the program ended well. I am equally as proud that for all of the people that were laid off, and this is probably 14,000 people that were laid off, I didn't hear a single instance of a person that had worked in the program that was interviewed in the media that was unhappy about how they were treated by the program. Almost every single case, it was just extreme pride that they got to be a part of the program, and they got to see this wonderful national capability retired in the right way, and that it was 100% successful, and we put Station in really good shape. And that's remarkable if you think about it, because the media was out there looking for the people that had just gotten laid off to say the bad words, and I never heard it happen. It was just a lot of pride that they'd been able to be a part of it, and that was, as much as anything, was one of the reasons that we ended up successfully, is just that pride people had in the program.
In May of 2006, the program manager was Wayne Hale, and he issued a memo or a direction to the projects and therefore their prime contractors to develop risk mitigation plans for human capital. And as a piece of that, there was a couple pieces to that. One was that they needed to identify what the risk would be for their project, because every project was different. They're in a different life cycle. They would be ending at different times. They had different needs, different workforce. And that so they needed to identify those risks and then identify plans to address those risks. And then as a piece of that also, he put in place a reporting structure so that people will come back quarterly to talk about how are they doing on workforce. And so there's a very strong focus on the workforce, and we ended up then with a series of risks that were at the project level on the civil servant and contractor side, and then those rolled up to an overarching program risk. Originally that was civil servant and contractor. Over time those workforce change, diverge, and so you ended up with a contractor set of risk and a civil servant set of risk. Those original plans were obviously aimed more at the contractors, but we also folded in the centers because you have different kinds of activities going on at Marshall and at KSC and JSC. So we want to make sure the centers were looking at addressing critical skills also. At the time you were gearing up Constellation, and there would be a natural tendency to want to pull your good people up for the new programs, and you need to do that. But you also need to make sure you keep the right skills to the end to manage the program through the end on both sides. So the overarching risk mitigation plan was a combination of the program in conjunction with the projects, but it's around communication and partnerships, it's around retention tools, and it's around planning, helping people see future work. And then, of course, as a piece to that, you have to have your metrics and measures and assessments. How are you doing in that process? So here are the areas that we addressed as we went through this. It's a series of things that come together to create the plan. Big focus is on communication and partnerships. I think in this particular circumstance, we worked well together as a team with the contractors and the civil servants. So we established some human capital working groups, human capital councils, so that we could share best practices between what the contractors were doing and the civil servants were doing. An example in this particular area is Lockheed Martin. They had just gone through Katrina, so at their facility was badly damaged, and they had to bring people back and to retain those folks. And so they did a lot of things in that environment that became very useful to the rest of us as we went through the shuttle process. They did stay interviews, they did career counseling, they trained their managers, and those are all tools that ended up getting used by a lot of the other organizations. And so that would be one of our best examples in the risk mitigation area of things that we did that got shared across that area. And so the next level on the communication front, of course, is going to be communication to managers and employees. The employees want to hear from their manager on things like this. And so one of the things that was a area of emphasis for us was to put those tools in the hands of managers so they knew what to say, when to say it, how to say it, what they were trying to drive across. In addition, we had communication going out to the employees through websites, through newsletters, through focus groups, through all-hands meetings, notes from the program manager, that kind of thing. So we tried to attack it on all fronts. And how we knew that is we had actually done an employee survey, and we asked employees, how do you want to hear about these things? And the number one thing was hearing from their managers, and so that's why that was an area of emphasis for us. The program had a team on communication, and we worked very well together. Their focus was on what communication should we be doing. The human capital side did kind of the content. They did the mechanisms and then the general context in the program. So there's a website for the shuttle transition. There was a newsletter rendezvous that was aimed at shuttle transition and helping employees see the future. They did a number of focus groups. We did a number of focus groups on the human capital side. All the centers, all the contractors have websites, and each did it slightly different depending on their particular circumstances, what they needed to do. The agency had websites. So there was a fair amount of trying to get information out through those kinds of things. That's a push, and not everybody pulls information that way. So we also wanted to get information out in other ways, and that's why we did things like manager talking points with the instructions, if you will, that those should be shared in a staff meeting. You don't just send them out, talk about them so people can ask questions. And then you had the all hands, and those were done at both the program level and at the project level and the contractor level about what's going on unique in your area, what do we see coming down. Sometimes we didn't know anything, a lot of times we didn't know anything, but it was trying to reinforce this is the progress we're making and this is what we're trying to do to help folks. A lot of it was, especially in the communication side, is what does constellation look like? What does the future look like? What is your path from where you are today to what that future state is, so you can see a path to get there. So one of the other things that we did, both on the civil servant and the contractor side, is try to figure out where folks were going to end up. Not Sue Leibert as an individual, but groups of people, the flight controllers or the systems engineers, that kind of thing. And we call that mapping. So how many people do we have today doing that function, and how many people will we need in the future? And part of that was to help people see a path to the future, and then for us as an agency to know where, at least on the civil servant side, where our gains, gaps, and overlaps might be. Contractors did the same thing because they need to do it from a budgeting point of view. How many people do I have working on this particular task? How many people might I need doing that in Constellation? So they were doing the same kind of thing. What that helps you with is a couple of things. Is if everybody's got future work, then you don't need a lot of incentives and retention incentives. If people don't have future work, or if that's unclear, or you're going to have a mishmash of that, so there will be some uncertainty for the employees, then you need to start looking at things like incentive pay. And it turned out over time, because of changes, all the prime contractors ended up with incentive pay for their employees. It was different. Some had a percentage of pay, some had milestones, some had a combination, some had everybody got a little bit, some had a few people got a lot, but they figured out what made sense for their particular project and for their particular company and implemented that. And what we found is that was successful. We'll talk about metrics and measures later, but we did track attrition, and you could see that the attrition was less for those people in the incentive plan than for those folks who were not. And another thing to help people with the idea of future work is we job shared, and that was both on the civil servant and the contractor side. So on the civil servant side, I might be working a particular task, but then I would go work that task in Constellation doing the similar kind of thing. Or maybe something outside my area so I can get some cross-training or some broadening of skills. Contractors did the same thing. They have, in fact, most of them are heavily matrix. So if I'm working as a systems engineer, I could be working multiple programs and projects. And so that also helps people with a path to the future. I've worked Shuttle, and now I can see where my skills fit into Constellation. So we found that to be very useful. It is harder for managers to manage that way. It's hard for employees to balance their work because inevitably everything's due at the same time. But I think in the end it was the right thing to do because it helped people see that path to the future and to give them that broadening experience that they wanted. Some other tools that we provided, if you will, for the civil servants and contractors was enhanced training, cross-training, the ability to look at where am I today, where might I want to be in the future, maybe take those classes earlier than later. Did that on the contractor side, also the kind of cross-training, technical training. In addition, on that side, the job skills training we started actually pretty early. Most contractors started that a couple of 3 years in advance. Most employees, I think, waited till the last year or so to take advantage of that, but it was the interviewing skills, the resume writing, where do you want to be, career development, that kind of thing, what's available in your area. That's a place where we then branched off into the local community. So in Florida, worked with Brevard Workforce, for example, in Louisiana with the Louisiana State Board, same thing in Texas, where you picked up the experts for that who set up specific job transition centers, brought in experts on resume writing training, using LinkedIn as a tool to find jobs, those kinds of things that help people then in their job search. Another thing that we recognize is that this is a huge sense of loss. Some people have worked on the Shuttle program their whole career or a majority of their career, and so that you are losing a community. In addition to the program itself, you're losing the community of people you work with on a day-to-day basis. Your family's being broken up. And so we heavily engaged the employee assistance programs. They provided counseling, they provided outreach, a lot of just sessions on here's what to expect. You're going through a grief process. Here are the steps that you're going to go through. We also did some training for supervisors and actually employees too about what to expect and what to look for in your neighbor. What might be going on with your coworker, whether they're a civil servant and a contractor, that you might see, that you might flag. Either talk to them or bring up to the supervisor that another person's having some issues. So we try to get out there to help people with that end of the program and the grief process also. So finally, one of the things we did, or a series of things we did, is how are we doing? And so we did surveys, employee surveys. We did supervisory surveys. We had the quarterly reports from the programs and projects, and then we had attrition that we tracked very closely, as you can imagine. On the surveys, we did that kind of from the beginning, so I actually have 5 years of survey data that's civil servants only that we're charging to Shuttle. And we asked them a series of questions. The most important one for us in the beginning certainly was, do you plan to stay till the end of the program? And that number started at about 60% and ended at about 70 or 80% at the end. So folks were committed to staying. That could be that the folks that were nervous and didn't like that uncertainty left the program, and that's fine, but as long as we had the skills we needed to the end of the program, so that worked. We asked them about communication. Who do you want to hear from? And as I mentioned earlier, they want to hear from their supervisors. What do you want to hear, and how often do you want to hear? So we tweaked our communication and how we did it based on those survey results. We tried to let folks know what they told us. That's one thing that sometimes we're not always good about, is giving survey results. So we always posted something out on the web, told people kind of what we had heard from them and what changes we had made. And so I think that was a really good tool for us. We got both positive and negative comments. The first year we got lots of comments. Trying to get through all of those, especially that first year, was tough. But again, those drove our communication plan and the messages that we sent out. We also asked supervisors the last couple of years, just in a red, yellow, green, do you think you're red, yellow, green on keeping your civil servant employees for the next 6 months and then to the end of the program, and keeping your contractor employees for the next 6 months until the end of the program? And it was very, just again, a red, yellow, green. So it's very unscientific. It was talking to civil servant and supervisors. Because so many are matrixed and it's hard for us to identify those, we just kind of sent that out as a web base. So it's not a very scientific, but it was an indicator of how we were doing. We typically only had 1 or 2 reds of a particular area. Almost everything else in the beginning especially was yellow, green, and then actually got more green as we got toward the end of the program, particularly on the civil servant side and even on the contractor side as we got to the end. We gave the managers a chance to tell us how they thought job sharing was going in that process, and they did. They talked about either it was very good or it was very hard to manage, which of course is not to be unexpected. But in general, we got a pretty good thumbs up on the job sharing concept as a tool to help people to the future.
The one other thing that I would make sure that I express to you in a word of advice that I might give you is you're not alone. And, coming up, if you're a technical leader or a project manager or program manager or whatever, you feel like you have all the answers, you're supposed to have all the answers. I almost never had all the answers, right? But I had an amazing team. And I learned very early in running the program that if I had something I didn't know, especially about a personnel issue or HR or just how to deal with the emotions, I had help. And the human resources team, Sue Leibert, Sylvia Kasmarzik, Paul Cruz, they felt exactly like I did, but they were able to go out and while I was working an ET structural problem or something else, they were able to do things and broker with the contractor leadership and with center leadership to to be able to come to solutions that really helped me out. And that would be just a huge piece of this, is make sure you use your team. Don't try to solve everything by yourself. Use the HR folks, use the employee resources that are out there, because they're incredibly beneficial, and they can do a million times better job than you can by yourself. Listen to what they have to say. You will end up putting your own spin on a lot of it, but they live it every day, and they're not working the technical issue, they're working the personnel issue. Use your experts just like you would in a technical type of an issue, and that was incredibly important for me. I used legal a lot. I used the HR people. I used the employee resources people, and I cannot express how important they were in the successful conclusion of the program. We absolutely could not have done it without them.
So how do we do? And I'd say the answer to that is that we did well. You got to the end of the program. We didn't have any workforce-related issues. One of the senior managers talked about how we got to the end, you extended for 9 months, and we still had no workforce-related issues. People stayed. We didn't lose critical skills. May have taken a little longer to get some of the assessments, that kind of thing, but we were able to do those in the manner they needed to be done to fly the program safely. So we got there. What were the lessons learned? The big one was, I think, communication. We did that well, I think, in that we brought the contractors and civil servants and the agency and the program and the projects all together, and I would encourage whoever would to do this in the future to do that. Could we have done more? Maybe, probably, but I think that by bringing all those people together and all those disparate groups together, that really got the commitment of the program, and people understood how important it was, and then two, we were able to share lessons learned across all those different organizations, and I found that to be very effective. So then the next piece to talk a little bit about is retention. We did do incentives for the prime contractors and some of the support contractors to incentivize folks to stay till the end. Those plans were typically backloaded, so you had to earn milestones, or you didn't get the money until you stayed to the end of the program. So it was truly an incentive to stay. Those plans did show to be effective if you looked at the retention rates, or attrition rates actually, of those people on the plans versus those not on the plans. There was a definite difference in that. Did the economy help us in all this? Absolutely. And now that it's starting to come back up at the right time for us, that's also a good thing for our workforce. But with it going down at that time, I think it happened. How much of the attrition was related or not related to the economy, we'll never know, but it certainly was a factor in that, and it did help us. We did find, and when in talking to people, that the money was important to them, but also the commitment to the program was huge, and I don't know how you balance those two out. But people liked working on the shuttle program. They were proud of working on the shuttle program. And a lot of the little things that we did at the end, the certificates, the thank yous, the events that some of the contractors did, all those kinds of things, I think, were also important to the workforce as we went out at the end of the program. On the surveys, originally that was actually going to be a communication survey, and then we realized that we could add a lot more to it. So it ended up being an employee culture survey, if you will, or temperature survey. How are they doing? The surveys did go to all the employees that charged a shuttle, so we were able to find all those. So that part was pretty rigorous, if you will. We sent it on a link. It was all web-based, so that was pretty easy to analyze. We were able to keep the core questions the same, so we had probably about half were core and stayed the same through all the way through, so we could track those 5 years, how we did on those particular issues. And then we added things as they came and went. Do you want to take a buyout? Would you be interested in a buyout? There were some incentives we were looking at. Would you be interested in those kinds of things? So we could add some things in and out, but the surveys really did tell us quite a bit about how committed the workforce was, at least on the civil servant side, what was important to them. The comments were very enlightening about what areas they were concerned about, and was a tool for John to know as the program manager and Wayne before him about, yes, I do need to worry about this area, or no, I'm probably okay in that area. But in general, I think the civil servant workforce told us they were okay from the get-go. We didn't see huge numbers that were looking to bail out of the program from the first day. And so it was a very effective tool in reassuring at least the management team about the civil servant side. And of course, the contractor side was the bigger side, but at least you had one side that you knew what you needed to do, and they told you what they wanted, which was more communication always. So in regards to the retention incentives, we did end up spending about $180 million. That's spread across 4 prime contractors and a number of subcontractors at key facilities across the country over a number of years. So this isn't a one-year kind of thing. It did end up being toward the end because of the way the contractors are distributed, but it was for a variety of people over a variety of time, and it is an appropriate expense for something that was that large coming to the end at the end of a 40-year career. So what would I tell the next person in this role for the next major program shutdown? I would say that the biggest thing is the communication, of course, and that's at multiple levels. That's what is the agency doing? Because contractors don't always know what the agency's plans are, don't really understand how they fit together. That's communicating with the centers across with the program, because sometimes those communications are at a lower level and not always at the higher level. It's communicating amongst the centers, it's communicating with the contractors and amongst the contractors. Is bringing those teams together, because there's a lot of people that want to do the right thing, and they learn from each other and they share, and it was amazing the amount of sharing that went on. So bringing those communities together is huge, and that's a great way to do the communication, to prepare, to plan, to implement what you need to do. Another thing I would tell the person following me is to focus on the communication with the managers, that your managers are your linchpin, your first-line supervisors especially, to the employees. And so to make sure that you keep that communication flow to them so they know what the future is, so they can continue to talk to their employees. So it's all about the communication there. And then to keep the flow going to the employees. And that's not one way. Use the surveys, use the contact us on the websites, that kind of stuff, to continue to gather information. Employees on the civil servant side want to know what's going on with the contractor, so that has to be a transparent communication tool that goes across both lines, and so people know what's going on both sides, because they do want to know what's going on in the communication. Another thing is retention incentives are very effective. The big thing there is rolling that out appropriately, working with the managers, doing a little benchmarking as to what's appropriate as far as the percentage, and that each company needs to figure out what's appropriate for their company. Some companies are more heavily engineering and have future work. Some are more heavily blue-collar and don't have future work, or vice versa. And so I think you have to work with those and recognize that each one will be different. It makes it harder for the program to manage, but it is appropriate to have those to be different.
If I were going to go through this again, or if I were going to give advice to someone that was in a program that was going to be canceled or retired or whatever, my number one thing is not technical. It's that you shouldn't underestimate how emotional it's going to be, not just for the employees, but for you yourself. And that surprised me a little bit, because this is a technical field. It's a technical activity that we do, but the strain of just communicating with people that are going to lose their job that you've maybe been working with for a very long period of time, going to factories that normally are buzzing with activity and bending metal and making things that are going to fly in space or to whatever the program does. Now they're dark and dusty, and you're thanking people and maybe handing out awards or whatever, but thanking them for 25, 30, 40 years of service, things that their identity is really wrapped up in. And there's an enormous emotional toll, and you have to find things that can pick you up. Shuttle program, that was easy. Launch will pick you up. A successful mission will pick you up. But you have to find the daily successes that you can celebrate with your team. You cannot allow your team to wallow in misery, or it's not fair, or we're not treated right. Hey, it's the fact, right? You were either defunded or priorities changed or whatever else happened. You cannot wallow in that poor me attitude, because your attitude is extremely contagious. People will take their key. Your leadership will look at you and determine how they're going to act. And you have to make sure that you're celebrating appropriately the correct accomplishments. You have to have the highest level of integrity, so that when people ask you questions, you answer them honestly. You don't hide facts from them. People are not dumb. They're not gonna be fooled for very long. You have to be extremely honest. You have to tell them what is going on, what your constraints are, what you're trying to accomplish, how you need their help, and that will serve you well. But you have to take care of yourself as well. And a couple of the senior leaders on the team that worked at Kennedy Space Center, I think it took an enormous physical toll on them to go through the emotions of seeing their team dispersed. And you have to really be aware of that and make sure that you're doing the appropriate celebratory things to offset that and have the right attitude. Because if you want to end up successfully, but you have this poor us attitude, then those two things don't work well together. Your attitude, people look to you every day if you're a senior leader, and they're going to mirror your behavior. And if your behavior is, hey, we've got a real challenge here, but we want to end the program correctly and treat our people right and accomplish our mission, then that's what will come out of it. And I cannot overstate at all how important that attitude is every day when you walk in the door. I tell you, it's sure a lot more fun developing a new program and looking forward and starting up factories and hiring people than it is shutting them down. But you know, I'll add one last thing. Even though it was emotionally very difficult, and this sounds a little egotistical, but I would not have left the program, and I think the senior leadership felt this way as well. We would not leave the program, even though it was very hard emotionally. We did not want to leave the program because we wanted to ensure that it was done right and that the people were treated right. And that's something you spend an enormous amount of time thinking about. Am I treating the people right? Am I letting them make the decisions they need to be successful? Because you owe these people. You owe every one of them, not just the program success, but your success. If somebody's not doing their job rightly, well, it will reflect on you. And they've worked for you. And you need to make sure that you will want to make sure that they're treated correctly, and you will end up staying and making sure that's done. And that's just the price you're going to pay to thank them for all that they've done for you. And that's making sure that you stay and personally ensure that they're treated right.
And then lastly, I think I'd talk about the workforce and the commitment of the workforce. We are blessed at NASA. They have a very committed workforce, and you found that in the Shuttle program and across NASA, whether they were subs, primes, civil servants, however they were attached, direct, indirect, there was a lot of commitment. I think you can't underestimate the commitment of the program managers. This was a top priority. It was a top program risk, and that was not done lightly. And so that got a lot of attention in top risk reviews. It got a lot of attention at headquarters. And so I think when you step into this role, there will be a lot of scrutiny, but it is a very rewarding role because it's a place where you can actually help the workforce and the program come together and accomplish the mission. And if you have any questions or want to talk about any of the things that we did further, I'd be more than happy to talk to you. You can find me in the NASA Global, and I'd be happy to sit down and chat.
Now, overall, this was probably the most difficult thing that I've ever been faced with. The reason we were successful in the end was because of an incredible contractor leadership team and a shuttle program and a center leadership team. It was at the same time as being the most difficult thing, also the most gratifying thing I've ever done in my career. And there are probably a lot of different lessons that can be learned that may be specific to other situations. And if you'd like to talk about it, or if I can shed any additional light on any of the comments in this video, please feel free to contact me at JSC. I'm in the global. It's John P. Shannon. Thanks.